And hello, Natasha Mitchell, joining you now for Life Matters on ABC RN across the nation. A very warm welcome to you. From the notorious baby farmers of the late 19th century to the last woman hanged in New South Wales, it is a show chock full of true crime today, with three writers who have investigated some of the most scandalous, the most notorious, the most complex cases in criminal history. At the heart of each are infamous women. Women who have killed or who have been accused of killing. Women who have been deemed dangerous for horrific deeds. Now, whatever the reason or motivation for their crime, or whether they are convicted or not, one thing seems clear at every stage and age throughout history. A powerful disconnect happens in the public mind when women kill, especially their children or spouses. And it can play out in the courts and in the media in all sorts of curious ways, as we'll hear today. How do we respond when those deemed as society's nurturers, mothers, wives, sisters, daughters, become killers instead? What do we feel when that social contract we assume is innate and intact is broken? Why do dangerous women seem to both excite and horrify? Is this ghoulish intrigue at work or something stranger? Joining me today, long-time newspaper journalist, author and now associate editor of the Women's Weekly, Carolyn Overington. Her latest book, Last Woman Hanged, tells the story of Louisa Collins, the last woman hanged in New South Wales back in 1889. From Canada, English literature scholar and former lawyer Dr. Kalindi Wrightson is with us. Her book, The Notorious Frances Thwaites, is a novel, but it's based on the true story of the so-called baby farmers and the case of Frances Thwaites, who was hanged in Melbourne 5 years after Louisa Collins was in Sydney in the 1880s. From the UK, now living in Australia, TV presenter and forensic criminologist at the University of New England, Dr. Xanthi Mallett's book is called Mothers Who Murder, and she speeds us ahead to the present century and looks at well-known cases of women charged with infanticide, the murder of their children. We shared the stage at this year's Sydney Writers' Festival with an audience gripped by what was to come, and we'd like to hear your thoughts today as you're listening to on our Facebook page, or tweet us at RN Life Matters, or you can post a comment on our website. Let's take it away. You know, most of us don't wake up of a morning and say, I'm going to write a book about women who murder. So where did it start? Why did each of you want to write this book? Caroline?
Well, it started for me because I was working as a reporter for the Australian newspaper, and at the time there was a gentleman on trial for the murder of his girlfriend. His name was Gordon Wood, and he was accused of the murder of Caroline Byrne, throwing her off the gap. There had been some problems with the process. He had had a trial and then there'd been a mistrial. Ultimately, he was, of course, acquitted of that crime. But they had had a second mistrial and were looking at the possibility of a third trial. And the editor asked me, can you please go and have a look if they've ever tried anybody more than twice for the crime of murder, because he thought that that would perhaps be unprecedented. I went and had a look in the archives, and up came the name Louisa Collins. And Louisa Collins is one of the only people in the world ever to be tried not once or even twice, but 4 times for the crime of murder. And I became intrigued by that idea. What was it about this particular woman, this beautiful, raven-haired, blue-eyed woman, this mother of 10, 7 children still living, little ones included? What was it about her that made them at the time so determined to take her to the gallows? And I couldn't let the idea go that there was this woman who went on trial for the first time in July and was dead by January, but only after they'd put her in front of 4 juries. 36 men declined to convict her. They had to wait for that final verdict and then rush her onto the gallows. Why? And I couldn't let the idea go.
What was she convicted of?
She was ultimately convicted of the murder of her second husband. They accused her of the murder of both husbands. So Louisa was married for the first time at the age of 18, and she was married for 20 years the first time. Then when her husband died, she very quickly got married again, which was not unusual at the turn of the century because the options available to women were very limited. They couldn't really work, and if they did work, then they got about a third of the male wage. So it wasn't unusual that she got married again quite quickly, but then her second husband died, and they decided that it couldn't be an accident, it couldn't be a coincidence, that she must have done it. And there were a number of women in the neighbourhood who perhaps were a little jealous of Louisa, who was very, very beautiful. I mean, honestly, when she was first put on trial, one of the newspapers here in Sydney sent a reporter out to the town where she had grown up, and people were still gobsmacked by how pretty she was. She was the little flirt that every other woman in the neighbourhood loathed.
So interesting that you talk about her appearance. I'll come back to that. Yeah. Xanthi.
When I was doing my PhD, one of the things I touched on was miscarriages of justice. And in the UK, we had some cases that were sudden infant death cases, and they had gone to trial and women were found guilty of murdering their children, and it transpired that some of them were not guilty. And some of the experts in those trials became very famous because of the evidence that they gave. When I got to Australia, I was doing some research because I'm a forensic criminologist, and I came across the case of Kathleen Folbig. And this reminded me of some of the cases that I'd looked at during my doctoral work. And it was strikingly similar to the point where they were still quoting the evidence that had been used and discredited in the UK back in the early 2000s was actually used in Kathleen's trial to prosecute her. And that caused me a lot of concern because now it's very well known in the UK that these cases, you can have multiple deaths as a result of sudden infant death syndrome. You can actually be predisposed, if you're genetically or environmentally predisposed to losing a child. You can lose another one more often. So when I saw that same pattern in Kathleen's case, that kind of set off a few alarm bells, and I started to look at individual cases more with more interest and decided to write a book around the women who were accused, because I think once a woman is accused of something so hideous as murdering her own child, then it's very difficult for people to accept that she could be innocent. It's like guilty by association. So, yeah, that was...
Remind us of Kathleen's case.
Kathleen Folbig, she lost 4 children over a number of years, over a period of about 10 years. And in each child's case, there was a medical reason why that child died. So it was only the circumstance of the 4th death, and the pathologist in that case was aware of the family history of losing 3 other children. The 4th child died outside the age range for sudden infant death. She was a little bit older as well, which was also setting off alarm bells. But again, there was a medical reason for her death. They all had issues with breathing, etc. So when she died...
And that had been established.
That had been established, fact. Yep, in each
not contested.
No, not contested. There was, well, some experts say that it couldn't have caused death, but there was certainly a medical reason pre-death that, was noted in the history. So when that 4th child died, the pathologist was aware of the family history and said that if it had been that one death, that one post-mortem, it would have been declared as, natural death. But because he knew of the history, then he thought that was suspicious and thought it should be investigated, that the circumstance of 4 children was just too unusual, that it couldn't be an accident or it couldn't be just bad luck, basically. And there was also diaries. She wrote some diaries in which she expressed guilt over the children's deaths, and there's a number of ways you can read those depending on your perspective, but that was certainly very influential when she was found guilty for murder and manslaughter and injuring those children.
And in her case, in a number of the cases that you document in this book, and we'll get to that, there are really torrid stories of abuse leading up to the death of the child. In her case, was that the case?
No, Kathleen, well, whether she has such a troubled history as presented in court is questionable. I've met Kathleen a couple of times, and there are certainly question marks over parts of her history. And if you read the book, you'll see that these women who often go on to harm their children, and whether Kathleen's guilty or not is up to debate, basically. To me, it's up to debate. Some of the other women are definitively guilty. So in their histories, there is a lot of abuse. That's something that came across a pattern that was very clear. So then who's culpable? Because their own childhood is so damaged. Who's at fault then? Is society at fault because we didn't protect them as children, and they can't have the same emotional relationship with their own children? How could they possibly when they're so damaged?
And your conclusion at the end of the book is absolutely intriguing. We'll get to that. Kalindi, how did you become obsessed, can I put it like that?
Yes, you can.
with this woman, Frances Thwaites?
Well, 7 or 8 years ago, I was in a former life working as a lawyer here in Sydney. I was living here, and I was working at the Supreme Court, and every Wednesday I would have morning tea with my favourite judge of all time in his chambers, and he was extraordinarily knowledgeable about all manner of things, and he loved history and he loved law, and I loved history and I loved law. So our Wednesday morning tea would often start with, "Have I told you about the case of such and such?" And I would of course say no, and it would be this really odd case but fascinating story. And then often I would then just go up to the Supreme Court Library and have a look at the case. And one of them was Louisa's case. One morning he would say, "Have I told you about Louisa Collins?" Then I found Frances, and I thought, first of all, I thought she's innocent. The evidence is so extraordinarily flimsy, even on the evidential basis as it was back then. This is in 1893 and 1894. And very similar to Kelly Lane's case, because there was no body. There were bodies here, but there was absolutely no evidence whatsoever that she did it. In fact, there was stronger evidence that her husband, Rudolph, had done it. The more I read about her life, and I spent 7 years gathering all this information about her, the more I thought she had a life that was stranger than fiction. And it was weird.
How was it weird? And where did you look? And I'll come to you on this too, Caroline. Where did you look for historical record about her?
Everywhere. All the leads were extraordinary. I would search Trove. So every morning I would sit down at my desk with my espresso and I would read Trove. Go on
the
to
National
the National
Library's wonderful archive.
Yep. And I would have a read of the Argus from 1887 or something and have a look at what was going on. I would search things. I would just have a general read of the news of that time, which would just inform my general feeling for the period. But then I would do specific research. So I would then search her name. I would search the name of her daughters. There's another daughter who I don't mention who comes into the other books in the trilogy. I would find out whatever there was there, and then I would go to birth, deaths and marriages, and then I would write off to places in England where Frances was born and gathered that. I got obsessed.
You got obsessed. Why was she weird? She strikes me as a very unlucky soul right from the go-get, right from where she's in London as a young woman. She has sex outside of marriage with the man that she's engaged to, and it all goes pear-shaped, and it doesn't stop going pear-shaped for her for some years.
No, that's right.
And then it ends with her being hung.
Yes, and her two little girls having been, one of them actually with her, at the time. Yeah, she was frightening. And I found her frightening, and the more I made up with, like that thing with the soldier, I made that up. There was one little idea that sort of floated around that, she was with this soldier and was a fallen woman. But I think that was just a journalist making that up. Because I just took that and ran with it and thought this will make a great part of her whole story, that she was a fallen woman. So Harry never really existed.
The man she was engaged to. Yeah. So you're playing with the truth a little here. Yes. Okay, we'll get back to that, but why was she weird?
Okay, she was weird because she was so unlikable. She was so frustrating that I would get really annoyed with her. Why wouldn't she just see things how they were? Why couldn't she be capable of just making a normal, logical choice about something? A lot of us will have crazy episodes, or we'll have phases that we go through when we make really bad choices, or we're really stressed, we're having a difficult time personally, and it will affect our choices about other things.
So what
Whereas
bad
with
choices?
her, it was
what
everything.
Bad choices did she make?
The worst one was to get into baby farming in the first place. Okay. But she was very desperate, and she was poor. And she had children of her own to look after, and she needed money. But it was a really bad choice.
Choice is such an interesting expression. For women in the late 1800s, Caroline, did they have much choice?
They didn't really have a lot of choice. Louisa Collins certainly didn't have a lot of choices. When she was living in the little village where she grew up, her mother, in fact, decided who she would marry and when. So when she was about 16, because she was developing a reputation as a terrible little flirt, with so many different suitors they described her as having, her mother made a match for her. And the man she chose was really boring. His name was Charles. He was a butcher. He slaughtered for a living. And he was a good 15 years older than Louisa. She loved to dance. He didn't. She loved to drink, and he really didn't approve. There were times when she was caught out, dancing in an empty house on her street, and all the neighbours wouldn't approve. But what could you do? You couldn't go anywhere. And also, from the age of 18, she began having children. So she had 1, and then she had 2, and then she had 3, and 4, and 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. She died at 40. She managed to fit 10 children in there. They didn't have a lot of choices.
How do you know she loved to dance? How do you know she was a flirt? Whose narrative is that?
The most marvellous thing about writing Louisa's story was being able to spend so much time in the State Library and also at State Records, which is out in the west in Sydney, a very cold room out there. What you do is you ask to see documents relevant to a particular Supreme Court case, and they bring them to you, and it's marvellous. And do you know why it's marvellous? Because all of these things are now 125 years old, and they have been kept for you. You can go there and examine them. So you can look at pictures of Louisa when she was younger. You can see her as she was in her jail cell the night before she died.
Wow.
You can see a sketch of her face when her head was shorn, ready for the hangman. You can read the statements that were given by neighbours who lived next door to her. You can see the judge's notebooks, the actual notebooks. You can hold them in your hand, that they had on the desk in front of them, that they wrote into as she gave evidence. You can see and hold the autopsy report by the doctor who sliced down her husband's chest. And the reason you can is because somebody kept them for you, knowing one day you would come looking. You would come looking, and they wanted you to see what they had seen. The idea that they wanted us to know should propel us in our desire to make sure records are kept alive. When you are being told that there are certain records that are sealed, there are things that you cannot see, that there is information that is confidential, fight it. It belongs to you, just as those records belong to us.
Take us then inside her home, 10 children, and the crimes that she allegedly committed. What happened around the death of her husband, Charles?
What was interesting to me was the process by which Louisa was convicted. And the heartbreaking kernel of truth is that she was convicted on the evidence of her 10-year-old daughter.
Yes.
Of her 10 children, only one was a daughter. The rest were sons.
Isn't that incredible?
May was only 10. And May she was 10 years old when she was asked to testify and 11 when Louisa was hanged. The Supreme Court asked her to come in to give evidence. She was described in the newspapers at the time as a remarkably intelligent little girl, also very pretty like her mum. And the judge asked her, "Did you see in your home in Botany any poisons that might be used to kill rats?" And she said, "Yes, I did. We had a box of Rough on Rats." Now, Rough on Rats was arsenic, essentially pure arsenic. They used to put a little bit of coal black in it to give it colour. Otherwise, you might mistake it for sugar or salt in your kitchen. It was incredibly deadly, 97% proof. And there was a box, May said, in their house. But there would have been, because all of Sydney, most industrial cities at that time, had a rat problem. And Rough on Rats was an extremely popular product. And there had been a number of deaths in Sydney. In fact, a man had been killed at a hotel by accidentally eating some sandwiches that had been spread with Rough on Rats to kill the rats in the hotel. So it had been a bit of a story. Yeah, a bit of a story.
Well, people got wind of it being a story and thought, this might be a useful instrument for murder.
Right.
Yeah.
And Louisa stood in court and had to watch May give this evidence. And in fact, in one of her letters from prison, which also survived to this day, which you can also see, as she begs for her life, she wrote to the governor begging for her life. And she said, to me, to stand there and watch my daughter, my heart and soul wrapped up in that child, give the evidence that will condemn me, was a terrible thing. But that, at the end of the day, was the evidence that convicted her.
And remarkably, one of the nation's founding fathers, Henry Parkes, who was Premier at the time, he weighed in on the case too. And he said something really, there's a great line he says, the women of Australia, what did he say?
He stood up, there was a big campaign to save Louisa's life because many women then, like women today, were desperately concerned about the inequities and the injustices built into the system. Primarily the idea that although Louisa was being treated as an adult on the gallows, being asked to hang for her crimes as if she was a man, women in fact had no rights at that time. They could not vote. They couldn't stand for parliament. They couldn't sit on juries. There were no women judges and there were no women jurors at all. So all of the 48 people who stood in judgment of Louisa were men. And women at the time became very upset by this idea. Their argument was this: if you are going to treat us like adults and ask us to hang for our crimes, then we are entitled to a say in how the system is run. We are entitled to the vote. We are entitled to make the laws under which we live. And so they petitioned Henry Parkes, who was Premier of New South Wales at the time, often also called Prime Minister because, of course, there was no national parliament. And he stood up in the parliament and he said, the women of Australia would vote to see her hanged. They do not approve of women who poison their husbands. To which women replied, the women of Australia cannot vote for anything, but not for long. But because within 15 years of Louisa's death, women became some of the first in the world to get the vote. They were so energised and so angry by this case, they began campaigning more generally for the right to have a say at elections, and they got it. And again, they didn't do that for Louisa. It was too late for her.
And a number of them believed that she was guilty, but they were protesting on principle.
On human rights grounds. And again, for you, for the rights that you enjoy today. Too late for her. For you, don't forget what they did for you.
And on Life Matters on ABC RN, Natasha Mitchell with you for an hour of true crime this morning with journalist Carolyn Overington. She's the author of Last Woman Hanged. And Louisa Collins was that last woman hanged in New South Wales in 1889. Dr Kalindi Wrightson is with us. She's the author of a novel, The Notorious Frances Thwaites, based on the true story of Frances Thwaites, who was hanged in Melbourne in 1894, accused of baby farming. And with us too is forensic criminologist and TV presenter Dr Xanthi Mallet. She's the author of Mothers Who Murder, and she starts her book with the case of Lindy Chamberlain, who of course was finally found innocent after years of jail time after the death of her daughter Azaria. And she was not a mother who murdered. So why did Xanthi start with her?
Because the publishers was very keen on the title Mothers Who Murder because it resonates, it's very evocative, I guess. But I really wanted people to read this book with an open mind because I think some of the problems in these cases come about because they presume guilt. You know, it's that pattern of circumstance. So you can't, 2 husbands dying, that can't be an accident. 4 children dying can't be an accident. So I wanted people who would read these cases, some of which were very well known, I wanted them to do it with an open mind. I felt that if I started with a case that was clearly the woman was guilty, they might read the whole book as if every case they were reading, the woman was guilty. And I actually wanted to challenge that right from the word go. And if there's a poster child for miscarriages of justice when it comes to sudden infant deaths or a child death, then it's Lindy Chamberlain. She was accused, and some people would still not believe that Lindy Chamberlain had nothing to do with Azaria's death. So
such was the public narrative around her case.
And when you read that, especially from my perspective, I was aware of the case, but I wasn't in Australia at the time, so I was separate from it. So I went back and I read the newspaper reports and the comments, and what everyone was saying in court, and they couldn't accept that there was a chance that she wasn't guilty, even though the evidence never supported. If you look at the timeline, what she was accused of was never possible in any world that I've ever lived in. So to me, looking back at it with that historical perspective and that kind of blind eye, as it were, it was clear to me, and I wanted people to go in reading the book with that open mind that the women could be innocent. And I wanted them to make up their own mind. I didn't want to tell people how to think or what to think as they read the chapters. I wanted to present the evidence and just let them make up their own mind whether they think these people could be innocent or not. And it was putting that question mark in, they could be innocent right from the beginning.
For women who have been convicted rightly of killing a child in this book, you still, though, at the outset acknowledge that women are treated differently in the eyes of the law through the lens of the media. But you also acknowledge in an interesting way, I thought, your own prejudices that are there, even though you hope that they're not, as a forensic criminologist.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody likes to think that they're fair and they're balanced, but when you listen to newspaper stories, and even since I've written the book, you hear about these events happening, and it happened actually more recently. Somebody was accused of murdering somebody, but the way the newspaper or the news reported, they said, this person is guilty. They hadn't even been arrested at the time, let alone charged, or been through court, but they said, this person, is being sought for murder. Now, I thought, if I was a jury member listening to this, what if I'm sitting on that jury one day? In my head, I've seen a picture of that person they're looking for, that they've now been basically found guilty in the eyes of the media for murder. I'm now going to presume guilt. Well, that's not right, is it? Because everybody has the right to be innocent until proven otherwise by a jury of your peers. So, yeah, that really was a problem for me, that you just listen, you take it all in, but you don't question anything.
But also you observed how you observe stories of women who kill their children. This is difficult terrain. It's challenging terrain.
It certainly is, because I think with the other stories we've heard, women killing their husbands, women are seen as nurturers, aren't they? And when a woman is accused of doing something like killing her own children, it's like the most serious crime that there is. And I think that's one of the reasons I also wanted to tackle it, because certain crimes like paedophilia or child murder, people want to stay away from because they are so emotive. But if you really want to challenge the way people look at things and make them ask questions about their own perceptions, their own bias, their own prejudice, then going to those highly emotive cases where it is the most challenging of all is the best place to do that. But again, as I said, I didn't want to tell people what to think. I just want all of the jurors out there to think.
And in each of these stories, Kelly Lane, Carol Matthey, Rachel Fitzner, that was the case of the little child that was found in the suitcase, Christy Abrahams. You do an analysis of how the media treated their cases. How do you remind us of the case of Kelly Lane and how you think her case has been treated in the public eye? Well,
Kelly Lane was actually quite an unusual case because unlike most of the women in the book, most of the women who actually harm children have quite a sad background themselves. There's often, not always, but often mental health issues, low socioeconomic status, low educational status. So a lot of these women have very few choices, even though they're living, most of them in this century or obviously giving birth in this century or end of last century. They don't have the choices that many of us enjoy. Well, Kelly was very different. She was Sydney girl, Northern Beaches. She had a very good family. She had very good education. She was a very good water polo player. She had everything going for her. She was like the golden girl. Now, she was quite promiscuous. She's never denied that. She had a couple of abortions. Then she gave birth and had one child adopted. And it was the second child, the second birth that she had
of three,
that child disappeared. She gave him, in her words, to the father, the biological father, and his then partner at the hospital. That child disappeared, but Kelly said she handed her over. It was the circumstance of the third birth that when she elected to have that child adopted, because she didn't want children. She kept having babies, but she didn't want to care for them.
And keeping the pregnancies a secret from everyone close to her.
Which is amazing.
I
How
find
do you
sort
keep
of
a
bizarre.
Pregnancy secret? Yeah. I don't know. Even as a water polo player.
Even a water polo player.
I know. I don't know quite how her boyfriend...
Her family didn't know. Her boyfriends didn't know.
No, I don't know how that works. No, how you give birth.
How does that work?
I don't know. I've never figured that out. But so it was when she wanted to have that third child adopted that somebody kind of looked at the records and went, where's the second one? And it took actually years for this to go to court because the police thought they were looking at a missing persons case initially. They've never found that child, but not only have they never found a body for that child that went missing between the hospital and her getting home 4 or 5 hours later, but they've never found a living child either. And that's why Kelly is still in prison today, still fighting it. She's been through 2 appeals. But until they find either a body somewhere in Sydney, I mean, how do you bury or dispose of a child's body with no planning? There was no circumstance that suggested she'd pre-planned to murder this child. How do you dispose of a child's body in Sydney in spring on a Saturday that's never been found? But then why has the child never been found?
And I was surprised to hear from you just now that there actually behind the scenes a lot of people are supporting her, fighting her own case. She hasn't made progress there though at all.
Well, she's had the 2 appeals, neither of which have been successful. So, yeah, there are certainly people... It's that circumstance and there's no body. And, OK, Kelly lied in court. She kept everything secret. She was promiscuous. And all of those things may not make her, the best person that's ever lived. But the fact is, that doesn't make her a murderer either. Lots of people tell lies, but it doesn't mean you would murder your own child. There's no question that she's ever harmed any other children. When she was actually being prosecuted, she was still babysitting for her friends. She may not be, the nice girl that, you might imagine from when you first start reading about it, but doesn't mean she's a murderer. And I think that's the big question mark. Why would she have adopted out 2 children and murdered the second one when it would have been so much easier to just leave her in hospital? Why would you do that? She's a smart girl, and that's a very stupid thing to do.
Kalindi, who were the baby farmers that Frances became enmeshed with?
Yeah. Mostly they were women in Carlton and inner Melbourne who had children of their own, needed extra money. And so they made it known among places like the Lying-in Hospital in Carlton, where a lot of single mothers went to have their babies, that for a fee... they would look after their babies for them. So it's a sort of Victorian version of modern-day daycare, But the problem with it is that a small proportion of those women were actually child abusers, in the sense that when the single mothers would come back to say, how's my baby doing? And often these single mothers were servants. And, of course, they couldn't have a child with them at work because they would lose their job. And they couldn't even let it be known they were pregnant at work because then they would lose their job. So they would come back and say, I'd like to see my daughter or my son today for a half an hour, that sort of thing. And the baby farmer, if she were unscrupulous, would say, oh, your baby's sleeping. Can you come back next week? Whereas what unscrupulous baby farmers were actually doing was leaving the baby there to starve to death and collecting the money. So she would collect the money each week, and this could go on for 6 weeks or so, and she would make up an excuse, or she would just say, oh, I've handed your baby to Mrs. Such and Such over in Rathdown Street. You'll need to go see her, but she hadn't at all. The baby had already died. So those women gave the trade an incredibly bad name. The only customers of the trade were women who were already shamed because they were single mothers, because other mothers tended to try everything they could to keep their babies with them. So these were children who were often, not that they weren't loved, but when they disappeared it wasn't always a dreadful, dreadful thing, because the women, the mothers were then free to continue and start afresh. So it was a terrible thing. And Frances, it was a very easy trade to get into because all you needed to do was know how to raise a baby. And if you have a baby, you learn it pretty quickly.
And that's what happened to Frances.
And that's what
so she
happened
ends
to
up in the
Frances.
midst of this trade.
Yes.
By that time, she's married a German in Sydney, but she's moved from him
Yes.
to Melbourne.
Yes.
She's got involved in the baby farming
Yes.
industry, so to
Yes.
speak,
Yeah.
cottage industry, I suppose,
Yes.
at the
Yeah.
time. And she's hooked up with another guy, and
Ted.
who doesn't know that she's actually married, and she
Yeah,
becomes
she
engaged to
lies.
him, and it gets complicated.
Yeah.
But what happens? Why does she end up at the gallows?
I think that what happens with Frances is that she had one extraordinarily bad night with a baby she was minding, baby farming, Lillian Crichton's child, and that baby died of convulsions during the night. And the way Frances writes about it, and her affidavit and the other legal evidence gathered at the time, sounds perfectly feasible. Babies do die that way. It's not very hard. It's actually not very hard at all if you read medical and legal evidence to kill a baby. It's very easy. It's very hard to prove. If you kill a newborn baby, it's extraordinarily hard to prove and extraordinarily easy to carry out. However, on this night, because of the problems this child had, not being able to keep food down, and having all these, going black and blue in the face and having these convulsions and gasping for breath, and Frances being up all night long with this baby, and then finally this baby dies, that is when she becomes notorious. Brunswick baby farmer, because then she has this body, and it's like 4 o'clock in the morning, it's dead still outside, the milkman's coming around in his horse and cart putting milk bottles out. It's too late for the milk because the baby's dead, and she needed the milk a few hours earlier but didn't have any. It's all too late, and she's sitting there and she thinks, well, what am I supposed to do now? I can't take this body through the normal courses. I can't call the doctor and have him come and fill out his forms and do all the normal things, because they're going to say I killed it. And they would have. So then she buries the body, and that's when it starts. And that, I think, that little baby was the first body that was then dug up in the backyard of that house. And then she had moved to another house quite quickly, and another body was dug up in the backyard of that house.
Which would make you wonder.
However, at the time, it would make you wonder now, but at the time, babies' bodies in backyards were extraordinarily common. So you might go into your backyard and try to dig up a vegetable patch or a flower garden and come across the bones of an infant, and you would not be very surprised. And you would simply cover it back up and dig your patch elsewhere, because burials were expensive. Questions were often asked when they shouldn't have been asked. They didn't need to be asked. Babies died all the time. The infant death rate was extraordinarily high. And people did extraordinary things at the time. Like, it was considered quite normal to mix up corn flour in water and force feed it down a 4-month-old baby's throat. When a 4-month-old baby cannot digest corn flour in water. And so, of course, that baby's going to bring that back up. Of course, that baby's going to start going black and blue in the face and having convulsions and things like that. So, and of course, then that baby's eventually going to die, because, you need to keep giving that baby liquid of some sort to keep it alive.
So there are 2 babies. Were there more than one? More than 2, beg your pardon?
3.
There were 3
all up.
babies. That's her baby count. And so I find it interesting that you've written this as a novel, and that at the beginning of our conversation you describe her as terrifying, and yet she lacks some agency. I get the sense that you're very sympathetic to her.
I am, yeah, I am.
So why do you think she's innocent on the basis of historical record?
Well, I thought she was innocent first from a legal point of view. And being innocent legally doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as being innocent in any other sense of the word. Okay, so I thought legally she is innocent and should never have been found guilty.
On the basis of the
evidence. Then, reading more and more about her life, I thought she's just a really headstrong young woman who does not want to be told what to do, as I was in my youth. So I could relate to her from that point of
like
view.
That, surely.
I thought, okay, I can relate to what you're going through here. However, that she never let it go, and she never channeled that strength into something else. Okay, and yeah.
I wonder whether there's actually some sort of psychiatric disorder, because, you said constantly making bad choices, borderline personality disorder. Some people actually seek out dangerous situations and almost intentionally make poor choices, and that's quite often what you see in that psychiatric realm. So, it makes me wonder whether that was just a part of her issue.
I think so. I think it was, but I'm not trained in it, so I could never comment on it. But I do think it was some, just my gut instinct as a non-professional in that field. I thought that's probably there somewhere.
Her executioner, the chap slated to
Yes.
kill her,
Yeah.
took his own life.
Yes.
And before that.
Yes.
And that was an illustration of the sort of distress and controversy around her case at the time.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that I'm not the only person to ever have thought, to ever have been drawn to her for whatever reason. She has this sort of strange power that does draw you to her. And he didn't want to kill her. She would have been his first female hanging. He didn't want to do it. And he'd been doing it for years, and he had this wonderful record of working men off the gallows, as they called it. And he was good at it. And the character, he prided himself on being really good at it. And the character I turned him into is just based on other stories I'd read about executioners who'd kept diaries or kept other things, and just sort of built that into his character. That I figured someone who has worked off the gallows, 13-odd prisoners, would be good at it,
Well, the dreadful death by hanging of Frances Thwaites, as told in the novel The Notorious Frances Thwaites by lawyer turned scholar Dr. Calendy Wrightson. And Frances was a real woman. She was hanged in Melbourne back in 1894 from a provocative Sydney Writers' Festival event this year called Dangerous Women. Natasha Mitchell joining you on Life Matters, also with forensic criminologist Dr. Xanthi Mallett, author of Mothers Who Murder, and journalist Carolyn Overington, author of The Last Woman Hanged, who was Louisa Collins in New South Wales back in the year of 1889. Louisa was convicted. There were two husbands. So her second husband, who was actually a boarder, she had an affair with him. Charles dies, her actual husband, or not before kicking Michael, the second husband, out. But the second husband comes back. They get married rather quickly. And there was a lot talked about in relation to her behaviour around all that, and rushing off to make sure the will is sorted before her first husband Charles has died. And I mean, the evidence is not. It's dubious.
There's no evidence.
There's no evidence. So you feel that she did not commit this crime?
I feel that it's entirely possible that she was innocent. I do believe that, but I'm not out on a limb. 36 people on 3 juries agree with me, so I'm not out. It was only the 4th trial that got her, and I think if you're going to try somebody 4 times, and this was a huge case, so people were lined up to get into court every day, and it was on the front page of all the newspapers, and people turned up to watch the execution. It's an extremely famous case, and so I guess if you try her and then you try her and then you try again, the jury eventually gets the idea what they're supposed to do, right? You're running out of, and also because there's so much publicity about the kind of woman she is. I do think we need to be a little careful that we don't, just assume innocence about people. I mean, I have studied the Folbig case, and I have to disagree with you in she is guilty as sin. She murdered those 4 children. No question she murdered those 4 children. And she would have gone on to kill others. And she is in the right place.
On what basis do you make that
because
assessment?
I have studied that case. I have studied the Kathleen Folbig case. I share your doubts about Kelly Lane. The difficulty with Kelly Lane was always that there's no body. And in my view, it's very, very difficult to convict somebody when you don't have a body, because how can you say it's murder? The crime of murder requires intent. Legally, it requires intent. And if you can't say how the child died, then I'm buggered if I know how you can say that she intended to kill it. So that, to me, has always been the quandary about the Kelly Lane case. But Kathleen, you said that you don't believe that she had a tough background. You know what happened to her.
Oh, yeah, no.
Let's not muck around.
Oh, I know she had a tough background.
Had
some of the things. There's allegations there was sexual abuse in her background. Her father murdered her mother, stabbed her.
That's where we're going here.
Yeah,
she watched the murder. She watched.
No, she didn't know.
That murderer. There was a murderous family that raised a murderous daughter who then suffocated infants and confessed it in her diary.
Oh.
Now, I feel your soft heart. I know you've got a soft heart, and I know it's an important story to include in the book, but Kathleen Folbig is a monster.
Although the stories included in this book,
Wow, that's exactly the
many
point.
of them were convicted rightly. So
Yeah, but that's all good, the fact that you feel that strongly, and you have your opinion, I have mine, and what I didn't want to do was tell somebody what to think. Exactly.
Yeah,
I mean,
but you were saying before, oh, well, you know, there's no doubt.
Oh.
There is absolutely...
But you have doubt.
As a journalist, I looked at that case 10 times because, as you know, that case has been in and out of court, and Alan Jones has been on the radio, and all these other people have been on the radio saying, oh, let's have an inquiry.
He's a great
I mean,
fact
let's be careful that we don't let murderers wander the streets, and let's be careful that we don't forgive women because they're women.
So pulling back now, that is an issue. That is an issue as you review these cases. Yeah. You have to think rather carefully. And I'm just going to say, at the end of this extraordinary analysis of very tough cases of women who are all, except for Lindy, in jail. Yep. You go, in my view, labelling someone as evil was pointless and almost lazy, an excuse to not think any more deeply about what they'd done or why. What I've read has made me re-evaluate some of the fundamental beliefs I've held in my whole life. Before, I thought pure evil did not exist. Now I believe in monsters.
Yeah.
That made me inhale.
It wasn't Kathleen's case. That was actually what really made me challenge that. I always thought that just saying somebody's evil, it's too easy. You know, people like to separate them from the others. I wouldn't do that. You would do that. You're evil. There's a distinct line here, the difference between you and me. And I never thought that anyone was ever pure evil. I think that you get good people and you get bad people. Good people can do bad things given the right circumstances, and bad people can do good things. And most people are a mixture of both. Very few people are all good or all bad. But there was one case of Victoria Climbier in the UK where this little girl was brought over from Africa by this woman who was meant to be giving her a better life. She took her to France, then the UK, and this woman got a new partner, and she basically tortured this little girl. They fed her like a dog on the floor in the bathroom. They tied her hands behind her back, kept her in the bath in a black bag, so she defecated on herself, urinated on herself. They beat her, and she died. She went into multi-organ failure eventually. They did take her to hospital at that point, but it was too late. She died. And to me, looking at what those two people did to that child, there was no reason for it. Like in most of the cases, you talk about Kathleen, yes, she did have a very challenging childhood, and a lot of the women do. There was no reason those two people tortured and murdered that child, and it was pure cruelty from what I could see. And if I think about pure evil, those are the two people that I imagine.
Yes, that was a very tough chapter to read. Let's come to questions, if I can, at that point. Thank you at the back.
I'd like to ask all of you your opinions of jury. If we're called for jury duty, we are not supposed to have any information, big joke, on the cases. Well, even then, as you say, everybody had prejudged everything. And juries, as they stand, your views, please.
Well, you know, I am a passionate campaigner for your right to know. And I honestly believe that when we say to the jury, well, you're not allowed to know anything about this case, or we try to select jurors who don't know anything about a particular case, we are insulting your intelligence. Because I promise you this, if you were called before a jury in a case, let's say, for example, in any murder trial you can think of, and I said to you as the judge, now I know you've probably heard a few things about this trial, and your neighbour says this, and maybe you've seen it on 60 Minutes or whatever, but I want you to forget about everything you've heard and just listen to the evidence as we hear it in the court. And then you did that, and you made your decision, and you left the courtroom and someone said to you, oh, well, you're crazy, I think that person did it, you're mad, I saw it on the TV. You could, within your rights as an adult, as a responsible member of our community, say, well, I sat there and you didn't. And I heard the evidence, and you didn't. And I came to my conclusion. And whether you agree with me or not, that is what I believe to be the truth. The idea that you've seen something, a new idea, and it affects your judgment as a responsible member of the community, is insulting to your intelligence.
Juries.
Briefly. I've thought long and hard about the jury system. I don't think it's a perfect system because I think there are too many things that can affect a juror, the experts and their reliability and all of that stuff, but I've never come up with a better way of doing it. I think it's the fairest system, and I think being fully informed is absolutely, I think we all need to know as much as we can, because juries can be a difficult place to make those informed decisions based solely on what you're presented. So not a perfect system, but I think it's the best one we have.
The jury system works, and I think anyone who says that, jurors haven't made the right choice, or, they've sat through the whole thing, it's about 2 weeks, right, like a murder trial. And you're in there and you're sitting through it, and the judge is the person whose job it is to guide you through it and decide which bits of evidence you need to hear and which bits you should not hear, and guide you through the whole thing. And at the end of it, you can ask that person questions and take as much time as you need. And they do, of course, hear and read things, and it's perfectly fine.
It's gone too far in our democracy. Honestly, I cannot impress upon you all enough how much you don't know. At any point in time in Australia, there are more than 1,000 suppression orders on stories that you have a right to know. Now, I am prohibited by law from telling you what those suppression orders cover. But just use your instincts for a minute. And when I tell you that there is so much you don't know about the case of William Tyrrell, the little boy who's missing in New South Wales, does that look dodgy to you, does that case? Do you feel like there's stuff you don't know? You're dead right. And I am prevented by law as a journalist from telling you what it is. And to me, that is a scandalous situation. And it is a scandalous situation that newspapers here in New South Wales are writing false stories. What you are reading in the paper is false. It is lies about that case.
Okay.
Because of suppression orders that exist apparently
Okay.
for your because it's for the good of you.
Got to get to some questions, and also support journalists. Let's have some. I'm going to take 2 questions in a row, and then we've just got a couple of minutes to answer them. So go for it.
I was just a little bit curious and concerned about the use of the wording flirt or promiscuous and how that affects our reading of women who are accused of these murders, and I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Right, I'll come to that. Thank you. Next question.
Thanks. It was another question about the Louise Collins case. I wondered if you knew what happened to the children, especially the daughter in later life, how the daughter felt about giving evidence about her mother. Did she know what she was doing, and did she feel that her mother was guilty as she was older?
Yes, I was compelled to know that too.
I'm going to answer those 2 questions together. With regards to how May felt about it, I'll tell you how she felt about it, because we know how she felt about it. She was 11 years old when they executed her mother. She was placed in adoption. When she was 17, she got married. She had a little girl. What do you think she called her? Louisa.
Oh.
She knew what they'd done to her. Of course they did.
Flirt, promiscuous. You used the words, though.
Oh, I thought you meant...
In relation to Louisa. Your use of the word flirt was interesting, and I picked up on your use of the description of her appearance.
Women were not meant to enjoy sex. They were not meant to enjoy the full pleasures of life. They were not meant to drink and dance and have different lovers and eat the whole fruit. And I grew up in a really feminist household. And my mother always told me, "You eat the whole fruit, Caroline. You go out there and you taste it all." And I tell my daughter the same thing. I say, your obligation as human beings, and particularly as female human beings, is to get out there and really live your life. Get out there and
let
try
that mango
everything.
juice run down your arm.
Just do it. Like, suck on that mango, because you are entitled to enjoy your body same as any bloke.
But surely, when talking about Kelly Lane, she was very heavily criticised because she was promiscuous. I think Kelly was judged because she had lived and she'd done lots of things that boys her age would have been doing, but I think she was judged differently because of it, yeah. I mean, there were babies as a result of that then went into the foster system, which is a different issue.
She had something about contraception. There was
she did. There was some issue whether
maybe.
she was, whether she was drinking a lot and therefore it wasn't working or whatever. But she was living life to the full. but I think she was judged differently as a female because she was doing that. So I don't think the world has changed really that much. And women are still expected to behave differently.
Calendy, what about your own sense of the Franceses of today?
Oh, I agree completely. The world hasn't changed at all. A woman who enjoys sex is still considered a whore, whereas a man who enjoys sex is not, is considered a jolly old bloke. So it's no different. It's much the same.
Well, so much more to talk about here. It's a tight little hour that we've got. Can I thank Calendy Wrightson, thank you. Caroline Overington, thank you. Xanthi Mallet, thank you. It's quite a discussion. Joining me at this year's Sydney Writers' Festival was Caroline Overington, author of Last Woman Hanged. Dr. Calendy Wrightson, her book is The Notorious Frances Thwaites. And forensic criminologist at the University of New England, Dr. Xanthi Mallet, whose book is called Mothers Who Murder. And I wonder what you've made of today's themes and stories. Join us on the Life Matters website. That's where you'll find the audio to download or stream or share, and you can comment there, or you can head to our Facebook page. Or our listener line is 02 833 1430. My thanks to sound engineer Stephen Tilley today. I'm looking forward to your company tomorrow. Natasha Mitchell saying ciao for now.